Welcome to episode 15 of Warmaster's Workshop. Today we're going to be creating a silicone surface mold. And to do that, we're going to be starting off by cleaning and prepping our object to be molded. Now this is my steel helmet that I've been working on, and I'm going to be molding the, the clay ridge piece there. And so I'm using some acetone just to clean the surface of the steel helmet. I want to get all the impurities out. You can also do this if you're doing this, or if you're using like a resin piece to cast over, or if you're using plastic to cast over, you want to make sure that you use alcohol instead. So you can use, like 98% or somewhere in the 90% proof alcohol, and clean with that. And so after we get our cleaning done, what I have done here was I have created a boundary line with plasticine clay, and basically the same clay that I used to sculpt this piece out of. And you can see there at the bottom how I kind of made a little paddle shape. And what that does is that keeps the silicone from running, like all of it running down the helmet and then off the helmet. I want to keep as much there as possible so that I get the correct molding done of this, that it's a successful mold. So I just take some of that plasticine clay and I just went right around it. I made sure that I left enough area there for the silicone to gather into, and that basically creates our support section. Kind of our support lip for the mold itself. And the plasticine clay, the silicone doesn't stick to it either. So once you're done making your mold, you just simply pull up the plasticine clay, and you're good to go. And you can reuse the plasticine clay for later. You don't really contaminate it with the silicone. So, yeah, that's basically how this was done, and it makes just a nice, easy boundary for the silicone. Now here we're going to be filling in. We're going to be filling in these open areas with the silicone. We're just going to mix it, and we're going to pour it in here. And that's where the concentration of the silicone is going to be. Now, is it all going to stay in that area? No, it is going to run outside of the boundary area. That boundary area is there primarily so that you know where to cut. After the silicone is dry, you'll know where to cut, so that you can trim off the excess dried silicone from that area. So what I'm doing at this point is I'm just putting some mold release on the helmet itself. I've sprayed some in a cup, and this is just regular smooth-on mold release. I believe it's an aerosolized wax, and I could be wrong there, but I've never really looked too hard in the ingredients. I just use it. So I've sprayed it in a cup. I'm spraying it in a cup, and I keep my sponge brush in there as I'm spraying it. This stuff is super aerosolized. It's really very atomized. It doesn't collect well. So I just put my brush in and spray it on the brush inside the cup so that I don't have masking fluid everywhere. So I'm rubbing this masking fluid all over the open area there between the ridge and the border area. If you do get some of this on the clay, it's not a problem. I mean, it's not going to hurt the clay. You can still reuse the clay. So don't stress out about that. In fact, later on in the video, you'll see that I just spray it all over the clay, and when I'm doing the other half, and it's not a problem. It doesn't hurt the clay. I'm still using the clay. Doesn't contaminate it anyway. So I'm just continuing to make sure that I've got plenty of mold release. Now the great thing too is that silicone doesn't like to stick to metal, so I have less of a concern of that. But I just want to make sure that it's, I'm just kind of just making sure that it's in there well. And now I'm just, at this point, I'm just spraying it on. And that is just to finalize it, to make sure that I have molding or demolding solution in every nook and cranny, because this is a very expensive Now, this is a very expensive thing to do when you make a silicone mold. You absolutely want to make sure that you don't screw it up. You're looking at over $100 worth of chemical, almost $200 worth of molding chemicals to create this. So, and at this point, what I'm doing is after I've sprayed all of the solution, I'm just going over to make sure that I don't have any hairs in there, and I don't have any foreign objects on the clay before we start to pour the silicone, because that will just get trapped in the silicone and it will it'll contaminate your mold. So you want to make sure you don't contaminate your mold. It's of primary importance there. Do not contaminate the mold. All right, so I've also, as you can see, I've made some little registration keys. I just rolled up some more plastiline clay into a kind of a tube shape, cut them off, cut them into pieces, and I just stuck them there in the open area between the ridge and the border. And what these registration keys do is they will allow the other half of the silicone when we mold it to fit snugly with this half that we're creating now, so we get a really nice seal and everything. The mold molds up perfectly. There's no slippage, and there's also no seam lines or anything like that in the mold. We don't want seam lines. You don't want slip lines or anything like that. All right, so now we're going to be mixing the silicone, and the silicone that we're using for this is Smooth-On's Rebound 25. It comes in a part A and a part B. Both of those parts are 1-to-1, so if you pour 2 ounces worth of part A, you've got to pour 2 ounces worth of part B as well, and then that would make 4 ounces of silicone rubber. And on this one, I believe what I'm going to do is I'm pouring 4 ounces of each, 4 ounces of A and B, which makes 8 ounces of silicone. It's basically half of those bottles that I'm using for this first layer. And this first layer is important because it's the layer that's going to pick up all of your detail. And so I'm using just plastic graduated cups for this, and then that's the final cup that the measured amounts of silicone will be dumped into and then mixed up. And you want to make sure that you use a graduated measuring cup, because if you don't, you will not get your proportions correct, and your silicone will take either forever to cure, if it ever cures at all, or it will cure too fast, and you won't get it out of the pot before it turns into a mess. So, all right, so at this point, we're just going to go ahead and mix and pour out our part A's and our part B's. We've already got our I believe that's our part A poured out. Always make sure after you pour your silicone into the cup, put the top back on the silicone bottle, because if you dump this stuff out, again, you're wasting a ton of money. Just the silicone here alone was about $40 shipped. Just this part to do this part, and I bought 2 what they call the trial sizes, which are basically they're 16 ounces. And that was about $80. So just the silicone in this mold cost around, and let's see, I want to say I used about 1 1/3 of a pack. So it cost around, I don't know, I would say $70 for the silicone in this mold. So again, not cheap. Maybe $60 to use for the silicone that I used. So there we've got it poured off. Now, if you have a degassing chamber, it's also a great idea to, after you've mixed your silicone, throw it in the degassing chamber. That gets all the little air bubbles out before you use it, and the likelihood of having air bubbles trapped in your in your part there, in your mold, is pretty slim to none at that point. Now, had I went with less silicone, I could have mixed it all in one of those measuring cups. I could have just used one measuring cup, but because I used as much as I did, I had to move it to another cup. I just didn't have the room. So I'm making sure I get all of this silicone out, because if you don't, then again, you mess your measurements up. So you really want to make sure you get all the silicone out, get it mixed up, It's very important. You want to mix this stuff for about, I would say about 60 seconds. I'm not 100% sure if I mixed it that long, but I did mix it a long time, and I did check to make sure I didn't have any, any weird colorations, that the silicone had the proper coloration, which is basically the color of a creamsicle, ice cream bar. And here we go with part A. The other one was part B. So now we're mixing them together. And if you don't have very good forearm muscles, you will have good forearm muscles by the time you're done mixing silicone, because even in this state, when it's not thickened and it's the viscosity and consistency it is now, it's very much like a very thick batter, and it's pretty darn thick, and it will tire your forearm out real quick if you're not used to mixing this kind of stuff. So just a word to the wise. If you need to, you can always use a mixing attachment on a drill. I tend to not use that though, because that beats in a lot of air, and then you got to get all that air out. So now we're just mixing it up, and I'm just using a wooden, like a tongue depressor, just a wooden, big wide popsicle style stick in order to mix it up. And you really want to make sure that you get it mixed up good. You want to go down the sides, make sure you're scraping the bottom, scrape the sides, get it really good and mixed, because if you don't, the stuff may never cure. It will take forever to cure. It's just not, it will not be very, very people friendly, I'll put it that way. And then you will hate molding with silicone for a whole time. And yeah, it's not that difficult to use silicone. You just need to be patient with it. All right, so now we're pouring the silicone, the first layer of silicone, over the or onto the helmet. And since this is brushable silicone, it's actually pretty easy to move it around with a brush. Now, you don't want to do that and put your gloved finger into it. I think that was just that was kind of a moment of, oh my gosh, this stuff's flowing over the boundary line there. But then again, that wasn't really a problem. It's not an issue. So. And you can see that the silicone does not run really fast. It actually runs fairly slow, which is good because it's being brushable the way it is. That's a really good thing. You don't have to worry about it running faster than you can keep up with it for the purposes of the molding. And you can see there's some air bubbles there, right there at the top of the ridge. Those do come to the surface pretty quick, and they do, see, they're coming to the surface, and they do pop, so that's a good thing. But if you're not careful and you're not quick enough, then your silicone will run faster than you can get it moved around. And you really have to make sure that you get this first layer of silicone in all of the spaces that it needs to be, because if you don't, you're going to lose the details that you absolutely have to pick up. And one of the things that I will say that I wish I had have done was make sure that I got silicone into the key slots a little bit better. That was the only part of this mold that didn't come out as well as I had hoped, but that's a really small thing that's easily fixable. So. And we're just brushing it all over the area that we want to mold. And you can see how the stuff is basically just, it's run all over the helmet, but The other thing you want to take notice of too is see the air bubbles are popping. You can see the air bubbles on the ridge are popping, and they are, they're smoothing out. So that's the great thing about brushable latex rubber. This Rebound 25 is that it's a platinum cure silicone, and it's self-leveling. So it does take care of its, as those air bubbles pop, it takes care of refilling those areas. So you don't have to sit there and stress, brushing those little bits that might, those air bubbles that pop. You don't have to rebrush that whole area. And you can see there's still a few little ones there, but it's nothing major. They are popping on their own, and I might even help them a little bit in some areas. All right, so I let it cure for a couple hours. It was around 70 degrees in my shop at the time. I cranked up the heat so that it would cure properly, and it would cure, as far as how the directions said. Now, right here, I'm touching the first layer to make sure that it is still a little bit tacky. You want to make sure that the mold or that the silicone has cured enough so that it doesn't lift off of the surface, yet it has a slight bit of stick to it. So it's a little bit tacky, but mostly cured. And that is when you know it is time to add your second layer of silicone. And you can see me, I'm mixing up the silicone, getting ready to add layer number 2, which is more of just a kind of a thickening layer or a support layer to layer number 1, because we've already captured all of the detail at this point in the first layer. Now we're just adding a second layer to just make it a thicker mold, and you don't have to worry too much about the the thing ripping with the second layer. So we're going to be mixing, and we're going to be going over the same exact area. We're going to pour the silicone just like we did for the first layer, and go back and brush it back over with a new brush. I'm not going to use the same brush. Make sure you always use fresh tools, because these tools are all disposable anyway. But you want to make sure that you use fresh ones each time you do a different layer of this silicone. Otherwise, you're not going to get it to spread properly. It's just not good, especially if you use the same measuring cups over again. That's why I use disposable measuring cups, because I throw them away when I'm done with them. I don't need to use the same cup over and over. The other thing that you're going to notice too is that I use less silicone on the second layer. The first layer, again, was to capture the detail. The second layer is just to kind of shore up and thicken up that first layer. So I'm not using as much silicone. I'm using I think I was about 6 ounces in total, so 3 ounces of part A and 3 ounces of part B. Mix it together. It's 2 ounces less than my original, than what I originally used. I'm either using 6 or 4. Either way, it's much less than what I used before on the first layer. All right, so after another 2-hour cure time, we went ahead and came back, and everything was cured. It was ready to go. So what we're going to do now is we're just basically going to trim off all this silicone run over, and we're also going to pull our pull it all off. We're going to trim and make sure we pull off all of the run over, because we don't need that hanging around. It's just basically in our way. So I just use an X-Acto knife, just run over it, gently, and look at that. It just pulls right off, pretty as you please, without any problems at all. Nice and clean. Doesn't leave behind any kind of weird residue or anything like that. And we're basically just going to we're going to trim off that entire section. All right, now that we've got everything trimmed off, it's time to add our final silicone layer to this half. It's a thickened layer. We're going to be thickening up the silicone so that it's like, it gets super thick. It's really hard to explain how dense it gets. It gets really, really dense. And what we do is we're going to be using a chemical, an additive called Thivex. It's also a smooth-on product. I can't remember exactly how many drops it is. I want to say it's like 4 drops per ounce, something like that. I could be wrong. I would suggest that you look that up. And it's also going to be different depending on your climate. If you need a little more, you can always add a little more. If you're in a really hot climate, you might add a little more to thicken it up better. If you're in a cold climate, you might need less to thicken it up. But it is a thickening agent. And if you thought mixing normal viscosity silicone was rough, you should try mixing this stuff. it will put a hurting on your arm. So we mix up our thickened silicone, and it will start to thicken as you're mixing it up. I mean, it gets real thick real fast. And I'm actually adding more drops to increase the thickness, because I want this layer to be this is the final layer. It's the thickened layer. It's the layer that basically protects the mold before we make what's called the mother mold. So you can see here, look how thick that looks compared to what the other two layers that we've put on. This is when the silicone becomes what's known as trowelable. So you can take like a mortar trowel and spread this stuff around. Now I'm just using, again, the these wide craft sticks here, but it smooths it around. I mean, it moves it really well. You can see the stuff does not run. So using it in a vertical application of this type is much easier. It does not run anywhere. And here we've got almost the entire mold is covered with this thickened silicone. We continue moving forward with that. And I'm just putting on small amounts just to make sure that I get this in all of the areas that it needs to be. It's very important that you get your detail layers covered adequately with the thickened silicone, because this is what's going to protect it. And I'm very lucky that I've made just enough. But then as you spread it too, you're going to move it around, and you're able to really control how this silicone is laid down because of its thickness. It's not like the thinner silicone where it's going to run everywhere. The other thing too is you want to make sure you get those registration keys nice and covered. You can see there I'm putting some extra silicone on that area. And now I'm actually going to cover up the ridge there in the center. And don't be afraid to move the silicone around when it's thick like this, because it's basically globbed on. You want to really trowel it around and move it around to make sure that you get the part coated properly with it. Otherwise, you're going to end up with some seriously just big globs of silicone hanging out, and you don't want that. But you do want to make sure that you get plenty of this thickened silicone in those corners, those tight corners that you see me putting it in there on the ridge line. You want to make sure that you're getting the silicone in those corners, because that is where the mold is the most delicate, because the silicone is the most thin. So you want to get that thickened silicone in there, get it covered really well. Otherwise, you're going to have tearing, and the minute you tear this mold is the minute it's unusable. You have to, if you know how to repair a mold, that's great. But most people, starting out don't. So just keep that in mind, that you want to make sure you get this thickened silicone everywhere so that you preserve your mold. It will help your mold live and longer lifespan, and it will make working with the mold a lot easier. All right, so we've let our layer of thickened silicone cure. We let it sit for a couple hours to do that, just like before, and it's nice and hard. It actually feels extremely durable at this point. It's very thick. See, I'm tapping on it just to make sure that it is cured properly, and So the next thing I'm going to do here is I'm taking out that plastiline border that I had made earlier, that boundary line. So it's really easy. I'm just lifting up the edge of the silicone, and look, it just pulls right out. It comes off so easily. And then after we get that off, we trim. So I'm going to do kind of like what we did after we got our first two layers of silicone down. We're going to take an X-Acto knife and we're going to trim. And we're going to trim that lip off that the plastiline created, that boundary line. So I'm just taking my X-Acto knife. I've got a nice sharp blade in there, and I'm just trimming all the way around, taking off the that lip created by the plastiline boundary line. All right, so I've already went around one side there. Now I'm going around the other side. And this first, this is the first cut off I'm doing here. We'll cut a little more off, but I'm not being super detailed about it at the moment. I'm just trying to get that off. There's a few little areas here I'm just trimming, but I just want to get that lip off, and then I'll go back and I'll make sure that it's that it's a nice straight edge, and that it complements the rest of the mold. Now, you don't have to be that detailed about it, but I would suggest that you definitely take your time and be patient with it and make those edges nice, because you've got to do the mother mold. The mother mold, the Plasti-Paste we're going to use for the mother mold, it has to cover those edges. So you want to make sure that you make those edges as nice and flat and pretty as possible. It just gives you a much more superior, finished mold. Now we've trimmed all of our edges down. We've made them nice and flat. We don't have any air bubbles in our edges or anything like that. So what I'm doing now is I'm just using some aluminum foil to make a boundary area for the Plasti-Paste so that it doesn't stick, so I don't get it on the metal of the helmet. It's not difficult to remove from metal, but it's just an extra bit of cleanup that I really don't want to have to do. So I'm going to take some time to put this aluminum foil around my edge, so the Plasti-Paste doesn't go any further than the foil. And also this will allow me to create some registration keys in the Plasti-Paste so that I can fit both halves together, the outer half and the inner half, and that will make it lock together a lot easier. And this is just regular tinfoil. I'm not doing anything special. I'm just tearing it apart and placing it under the entire edge of the silicone here. All right, now you're going to see me make my registration keys and get those placed here. To make those, I'm just using some more plastiline clay, because the Plasti-Paste that we use for the mother mold does not stick to plastiline clay. You can see I'm just sticking it there right on the tinfoil. It doesn't want to stick well because it is tinfoil, but it does stay. And I just make three. I make one for each side right at the bend of the mold, and then I make one at the top, right where the crown is, and you'll see me put that one on as well. And they're just three. You don't need to make a whole bunch of registration keys like you do for the actual mold itself. That's just not necessary for the mother mold. You just need to make three so that they will slip in, and have a male side and a female side, so it all slips in together, and that's it. And that will line up the mother mold halves so that you can put them together and pour in whatever you're using to make your actual cast out of. All right, so I ended up having to cover those plastiline registration keys with foil to get them to stay. They wanted to keep falling off, so it wasn't a big deal, but I did go ahead and cover them with foil, get them added back on, and they worked pretty well. So now we're going to move on to making our mother mold out of Plasti-Paste. Now, Plasti-Paste is a smooth-on product. It is basically creates a hard shell. It uses a part A solid mixture with a part B liquid mixture. And so what you do is you measure them 1 to 1, and so if you're using 8 ounces of the solid part B, then you want to make sure that you're using 8 ounces of the liquid part A. And I use just a half of a milk jug to mix these together, because it is, again, it's another stout product to mix. So you can see my part B is there in the milk jug, and now I'm pouring in the liquid part A. It is a resin. And I'm pretty sure it's an epoxy style resin. But I'm pouring this in. It doesn't have as much of a pot life as silicone does, but again, it's not an easy thing to mix around, so I'm just mixing it in here. And when you mix this stuff, you want to get it to the consistency of what I call a cake batter. So if you've ever made a cake, or you've ever watched your mom or your grandmother or whoever make a cake, you'll know what I mean when I say cake batter. It'll be a very thick, it's going to have a very thick viscosity to it. And almost, it's going to be trowelable, just like the thick silicone layer was. So there we are, mixing it up, really working out those forearms. And you got to remember, I did all this in, at least up to this portion was all done in a day. So my arms were pretty darn tired after all this. I'm still mixing it up. I just had to, cradle the milk carton there, the milk jug. And you can see how it's starting to look like cake batter. It's got that really nice kind of golden consistency. Now, at this point, I'm just going to use the mixer, or the wooden mixing paddle, and I'm just going to spread it all over this thing. So I end up using all of the Plasti-Paste to make both halves. And the Plasti-Paste wasn't super expensive. I want to say it was cheaper than the Rebound. So it was in the $30 shipped range. But I did end up using all of it. I used half of it to make this half, and I used the other half of it to make the inside half. So you'll go through quite a bit of Plasti-Paste, but that's recommended. And that's the thing about Plasti-Paste. You need it to be thick. You need your mother mold to be thick, and you need it to be durable. And the only way to do that properly is to have enough of the material, the Plasti-Paste material. So don't scrimp out on it, because you'll kick yourself if you break your mold, and before you get full usage out of it. If you're doing this to mass produce props, every bit of money that you can pour into making a good solid mold is just a return on your investment down the road. That's probably the most expensive part of mass production, is making your molds. So you want to use those molds as long as possible, because if you don't, you're going to find out that that's a huge expense. So at this point, I'm continuing to put it on there and just smoothing it out. So we'll watch this process, and you can see how I put it on and smooth it out and really make a nice looking mother mold. Now I'm using a high 90% isopropyl alcohol here to help me smooth out the Plasti-Paste. So I pour out some alcohol in a little tin there, and I use a brush, and I dip the brush in the alcohol, and I use that to help me smooth the Plasti-Paste out really nice. So you can see how the alcohol is wetting it, but it's not hurting the consistency of the Plasti-Paste. It's just making it spreadable without allowing it to stick to the brush. We don't want it to stick to the brush. Then we'd be pulling it all over the place. We've got a really nice shape here. It almost kind of has a sort of beehive look going on there, like a hornet's nest. We just want to make sure we don't have any jagged edges. We want to soften up the surface and really, really make it so that it's a nice, smooth, unjagged surface, so that it's easy to work with. All right, so I waited about, I don't know, an hour and a half. I let the Plasti-Paste get fairly dry. I'm removing my piece of Sintra underneath. Now the Plasti-Paste is not fully cured at this point. What I'm doing is I want to cut those edge pieces off. See the bits around the edge? I want to cut that jagged edge off so that I can make it a nicer, flatter edge, just like we did with the silicone, so that it's easier to pull. It's easier to pull off the helmet that way. It's also easier to mold the inner half of the mother mold when we get to that point. It's easier to mold them together and have them sit together if it's nice and flat. If it's a nice flat surface. Also, you can see how using the alcohol and the brush made the surface unjagged and nice and flat there. It's comfortable to hold. But the Plasti-Paste isn't fully cured yet, or else it would be much more difficult for me to cut it off like that. And I'm just using a razor knife. I should probably be wearing a pair of gloves. But I'm being very careful on how I'm using my razor. And you just go over all the edges. See, there's a little bit of Plasti-Paste that got on the metal, but it literally will come off with a fingernail. And I hardly have any fingernails, so if it comes off with that, you know it's pretty easy to take off. All right, so here we are with our outer surface mold removed from the helmet. And all I'm doing here is I'm just using a clean bristle brush to get any little bits of residue that may have come off during the demolding process. And you can see that I also have the actual clay mold is still in the silicone. Now, full disclosure on that, it did not come off the helmet when I pulled the silicone mold off. I had to actually cut that off of the helmet, and it came off in two parts. It didn't come off easy, didn't want to. And then I put it back in the mold and put it back together. Had to do some reconstitution of some of those lines, and I had to do a little more, a little more work on it. You can see how I hollowed out the center. I hollowed out the center there, so that's an air channel. So there's an actual fan that fits inside there. But what I'm going to do now is I'm just spraying it down with mold release so that we can start pouring the silicone in here to make the other half of our mold. And again, I'm not afraid to use plenty of mold release. Okay, mold release is a molder's best friend. So don't be afraid to use it. It's not expensive stuff. It lasts a long time. I like to use enough of it so that I start to get a wet look on my mold before I start pouring silicone. All right, so here we're doing our first layer of silicone. We've got our, we got everything. We're mixing it up right now. We got all of our part A and part B in there at the right proportions. Remember, it's always 1 to 1. So 1 ounce to 1 ounce. And we're just mixing it up real good. You can see how I really like to scrape those sides. That's extremely important. I know I talked about it earlier in the tutorial here, but you can't talk about it enough. Really scrape those sides down. You want to make sure that part A and part B mixture is correct. So we're scraping it down, we're mixing it. And we're going to be, in fact, I mixed it so hard I actually ended up breaking the stick there, but that was okay. It wasn't a big deal. I just get really, paranoid about mixing silicone because I know how expensive it is. I don't want to waste it. So just always think about it in that context, and you will never have a bad mold. So I think I've mixed it up enough at this point. We're getting ready to pour it, and we're just going to pour it the same way we poured our first layer when we were doing the outside. When we were doing the outside of this piece. So here we go. We're just pouring it in. We're going to get it all in there, and then we'll worry about brushing it around to fill everything up. And just like we did on the outside portion, we're going to make sure we get it in those registration keys real well, and just so our mold fits together properly. Those registration keys really came out very nice. You can even see the seam from the helmet dome right down where the skinny portion starts to widen out there at about halfway down. That's the actual seam of the dome of the helmet. So silicone really does a great job at capturing the details. If you pour it well, you take your time and you're patient with it, you'll really come out with a great mold. Because the inside here does not have a lot of detail, I'm not really worried about doing more than one layer of thin silicone. So at this point, I'm just mixing up silicone to do the second layer, which on this side will be the thick layer. So we're only going to have 2 layers on this side. We'll have one that we just poured that was the thin layer, and now we're going to have the thick layer. And that's what I'm mixing up now. I just put the Thivex in and mixing that up to get it really kick off that thickness, that viscosity, and then we will begin to spread that around, getting it in all the registration slots and really making sure that it comes out nicely. So prepare your forearms again. See how thick that is. That stuff is just like paste. But that's part of the fun of making a silicone mold. Means you're really going to work those arms up. So it's a great exercise routine. So here we go with the thickened silicone. We don't have as much surface to cover as we did before. So again, another reason why we only are going to use 2 layers of silicone in this. But I am making sure that I get all of the silicone out of there because I don't want to run short. All right, now the moment of truth. We have let our silicone dry for this layer, or the inside layer. We've also went ahead and trimmed it. And now we're just going to make sure that it looks good. And look at that. We're going to peel it right off. Look how nice that looks. Registration key formed nicely in there. And it just peels right off. Look at that. Just so nice and perfect. And look at how the detail was captured in there. I mean, I would say the only thing that I wish had had worked a little bit better is if I'd have gotten those registration keys along the sides. If I'd have paid a little bit more attention to them. But other than that, the mold actually came out beautifully. The silicone works beautifully. It just matches side A to side B or outside to inside. It matches perfectly. You just get those registration keys in place. You push them down. Look at that. It came out just so nice. So now we're going to go back to making our inside mother mold half. And what I'm doing here is I'm using some plastiline at the bottom to make a sort of like a dam, so that the mold doesn't close completely. I want to keep a little bit open there, so for my pour spout. So we're gonna take and put this Plasti-Paste all over this mold. Now another thing that I've done that you haven't seen here yet either is that I have covered the mold with mold release. That way this side of the Plasti-Paste doesn't stick to the other side of the Plasti-Paste. Otherwise we'd have a problem. And here we're stirring it up again. We're making our cake batter, our Plasti-Paste cake batter. Getting it nice and stirred up. It is a pain. Just making sure that little plastiline dam down there, that little lip is in the right position, in the right spot. Now we're at the right consistency. We're happy that it's mixed together. And I'm just pouring it in. And I'm not even bothering with putting it in, doing little bits at a time like I did with the outer half, because this inner half, it's got kind of a cup shape, so it's not going to go anywhere. No, I don't have to worry about the Plasti-Paste, flowing outside of anywhere that I push it because of the shape of this inner part of the mold. And now just using the wooden mixing spatula, I'm just going to move it all around, get it, I'm getting it basically edge to edge. The other thing I have to watch out for too is because of the cup shape of this, I don't want all of the Plasti-Paste to gather in the center. So that creates kind of a little bit of a conundrum there, or just a little issue that I have to always watch for, is that Plasti-Paste gathering all in the center and flowing from the edges to the center, because that could really cause some issues in the strength of the mold. You want to make sure that the Plasti-Paste is even across the entire mold surface if you're making a proper mother mold. So. And we're just going to continue to spread it down, so you can see how much is in the center. There's a lot of that Plasti-Paste in the center. All right, and now we have let our inside half dry. And what I did beforehand, what you don't see here, is that I took my X-Acto knife and I did run around the edge just to make sure that it was already cut, and that the edges didn't, anywhere that I may have missed with the mold release, didn't bind together. So I just took my X-Acto there, ran around the edge where the seam was at, and that will allow us to pop this open and really nicely, and you'll have a nice flat edge. So at this point, we're done. All we have to do is open it up. So I'm just going to use a flathead screwdriver here, and I'm going to go around the edges and just lift up, and look at that. It pops right open. There's our inner half. We pull that out, and look at that. I've already removed the clay, but look at the detail captured by the silicone. You can even still see the mandoa, and you can even see the sculpt marks from the clay on the inside there, where the air channel is at. All of the key slots on the back, I mean, you can see it captured some really great detail. But it's just it came out perfectly. I could not have asked for a better example of a surface mold. That's that end there where the hole is where we cut our we cut our pour hole. And you can see how each of these halves fit right onto the Plasti-Paste. But we'll cut our pour hole there at the bottom where it's open. And then we'll fit those two halves back together, and we'll pour our mold. But yeah, this is a perfect example of a two-sided surface mold made out of Rebound 25 and Plasti-Paste 2. So I hope you have enjoyed this tutorial, and we will see you next time in Warmaster's workshop.